Along his fence line, 200 warriors waited silently, their painted features gleaming in the early morning light. Not one of them shifted, none of them said anything. They simply observed Malachi Brooks through his cabin window as he shook his hands and held his coffee cup. He had been nothing yesterday. A virgin rancher who had never even shared a kiss. Lady much less comprehended the traditions of the indigenous groups that inhabited these boundless plains. He was the focal point, today, of something he was unable to understand. Something that had started with just his jacket and a woman's smile of gratitude. The night before, the storm had unexpectedly arrived, causing the sky to turn as dark as ink and sending rain fell in sheets across his remote property. Malachi was in the tiny corral inspecting his horses when he saw her. A figure with her buckskin and her black hair pasted on her shoulders staggered amid the rain. The clothing was wet through. She moved like someone fighting against more than just the weather. Every action is intentional but worn out. At the time, he followed his instincts without giving it much thought. He yelled, "Ma'am, you need shelter!" Sprinting through the muck in her direction, as she turned, he could see through the rain that her dark eyes were full of. It appeared to be fear. She was afraid of something else, not of him, but of something that caused her to look. "I cannot stay," she said over and over her shoulder toward the tree line. Her accent was delicate yet strange, and every word she said was carefully selected. Her voice was hardly audible above the storm. Anxiety, however, Malachi followed his mother's instructions as lightning split the sky and highlighted her trembling form. He was compassionate to a stranger in need before she passed away, and he took off his heavy wool without thinking twice, slung it over her shoulders and put on the jacket his father had worn during the bitterly cold winters. As the jacket enveloped her demeanor shifted, and she gazed down at the aged leather cloth like though it were made of gold, then rising back up at his face with such force that his heart began to rush in ways "You would give this to me?" she muttered, but he didn't understand. "Just until the storm passes," he said, feeling hot rise to his cheeks. "You're freezing." She tightened her jacket, and they stood for a while. Two strangers were exchanging something in the rain that seemed more significant than the straightforward conversation that was taking place. She grinned, but it was a deeper smile that appeared to stretch beyond the courteous expression of appreciation he had anticipated. "I shall remember this. My name is Ayanna," she said. "Malachi Brooks." Into regions of his soul he didn't know existed kindness, Malachi Brooks. Before he could offer her his cabin, she vanished into the night, abandoning him with questions he couldn't answer. He stood by himself in the rain, unaware that his simple act of events that would alter not only his life, but also the delicate equilibrium between two universes had just been triggered by compassion. One thought now raced through his head as he gazed out his fence at the quiet army. What had he completed? Malachi had been observing the warriors for 3 hours as the sun rose higher, but they stayed still. His mind was spinning with all the reasons why they may be there, and his food was getting cold on the table. They weren't immediately threatening him, but the sheer volume of them chilled him to the bone. 200 men could overwhelm his tiny. If they wanted to, they could homestead in a matter of minutes. He attempted to carry out his daily duties, feeding the chickens and examining the water trough. Yet it felt like every motion was being observed, scrutinized, and evaluated with inscrutable expressions. The soldiers' painted faces followed his every move. Some carried bows, while others stood like living statues, holding long spears. But none of them had drawn their weapons, forming a human wall that ran the whole length of his property boundary. As the morning progressed, Malachi became aware of. He felt uneasy about something. More soldiers were coming. Small groups appeared from the far-off hills, their horses galloping steadily in the direction of his ranch. By noon, they positioned themselves with military accuracy, filling every available space, and what had begun as 200 had increased to almost 300. He recognized this wasn't random. as they gaped along his fence till their formation didn't break. Wasn't a hunting party that happened to stumble across his property. Rather, this was planned, deliberate, and structured. But for what? He was plagued by the image of Ayanna's appreciative smile and the way she had gazed at his jacket, seemingly indicating something far beyond its useful warmth. Her meticulous pronunciation of his name, with each syllable sounding like his father had forewarned him, and it mattered. Her black eyes were intense as she vowed to remember his generosity, about the difficulties of interacting with the indigenous people, but such cautions had always appeared aloof and theoretical. With hundreds of armed fighters now at his door, Malachi wished he had given more thought to those lessons. At midday, he noticed a stir, a warrior, taller than the others, dismounting from his horse and approaching them while sporting a lavish feathered headpiece. Hut. This man's face wasn't painted for battle like the others. It was solemn but not antagonistic. As he walked with the assured gait of someone used to authority, Malachi's hand automatically went to the weapon above his hearth, then came to a halt, 300 fighters against one novice rancher. The weapon would only be used to guarantee his own demise. The leader halted at precisely 10, talked in unaffected English, and paced off Malachi's front porch. The man knew his name, so it wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," said Malachi Brooks. Despite his quivering knees, he responded, "I'm Takakota, the leader of the traveling Lakota band." Malachi's heart pounded against his ribs. "These lands! We have arrived at the woman. Who is she?" Takakota's eyes narrowing her eyes a little, the woman studied Malachi's face as intently as a guy reading trails in rough terrain. "The woman who now wears your jacket. You provided shelter throughout the storm." The words struck Malachi. Like a blow to the body, Malachi remarked, "Ayanna was cold, but why would that matter to an entire tribe?" She was still wearing his jacket. Feebly, something flared across Takakota's aged features, an expression that said, "I was just being neighborly." Malachi was unable to interpret. The air felt heavy with the weight of the chief's voice. When he spoke again, like smoke from a far-off fire, the question hung in the air. "Young rancher, do you know who she is?" Malachi gazed at Takakota's weathered face, looking for hints that he was unable to decipher. There was a pause between them as 300 warriors awaited his response to an ambiguous question. "My name is Ayanna," she said. Malachi answered. His voice was not as large as he had planned. "All I know is that—" Takakota's face grew serious. "You don't only need to understand." The leader pivoted and pointed at the gathered fighters. "These men would all sacrifice themselves for her." Without hesitation, they left their families behind and rode for 2 days in a row, after learning that she had been spotted wearing his jacket alongside a white rancher. The blood drained from Malachi's face. "I don't comprehend." "The item was merely a jacket," Takakota reiterated. "Just a jacket," and something Malachi's skin crawled at his tone. "What did she do when you offered it to her, young rancher?" "Tell me." The memory returned with uncomfortably sharp clarity, the way the jacket had caught Ayanna's attention like a priceless item. The manner she had inquired as to whether he would actually give it to her. When she pulled it around her shoulders, her eyes were intense. She appeared taken aback. Malachi acknowledged that perhaps she wasn't accustomed to being kind to strangers. Takakota gave a slow nod. "She's my daughter." Malachi was struck by the words. Similar to a physical strike. The daughter of the chief's daughter, had received his jacket. It makes sense why 300 warriors had shown up at his fence. "I didn't intend to offend you, sir." Malachi stumbled. "I was merely attempting to assist. I was unaware of her identity." "That much is obvious." Takakota said, "Had you been aware, you would never ventured to speak to her." Malachi's thoughts whirled. Was honor at stake here? If he had spoke to her and touched her with his jacket, in some way breaking their customs? The potential frightened him. Now what? he inquired. Takakota looked at him for a while. Malachi's spirit seemed to be weighed down by his dark gaze. That is dependent on numerous factors. Why, in the storm, was she by herself? She accepted your jacket, but why? Most significantly, the chief's voice fell no more than a whisper. What prevented her from returning home last night? Malachi was taken aback by the final query. You mean she didn't return home? 2 days ago, Ayana left our camp to collect herbs for her grandmother's medication. She ought to have come back before the storm hit. This morning, when our scouts discovered her horse. You're still wearing your jacket, she wasn't there. Malachi's legs almost failed him. You think something happened to her? Think, Takakota replied, his tone tinged with danger, that you were the last to see my daughter alive. The charge hung like a sword between them. 300 warriors' eyes were staring at Malachi. There, the quietness that existed earlier now feels more like the quiet before violence breaks out than it does like patience. She went out by herself, Malachi objected. She mentioned her people would be